Tonight I'm going to teach you about the development of today's rock and roll music. It is a proven fact that through archaeological discoveries that music dates back to the beginning of human civilizations. Now, due to my inside knowledge of the music industry, being a musician for the last 20 years of my life, I'm going to take you on a little trip through the history of music. So let's take a trip down memory lane. And when the United States was very, very young, classical and folk music seemed to be the main form of music that was portrayed in society. Many of the original music numbers for the United States were very patriotic and made to inspire people to be better Americans. According to H. Wiley Hitchcock, in his book Music in the United States, A Historical Introduction, folk music was transitioned into country music, which is the first music that can be called an American original. It was blended with a steel guitar and a good old twang and gave it its first original heritage. Carter Hardman states in his book, A History of Popular Music, that technology was changing and the use of electricity was making it possible to amplify music to larger audiences than it ever had before with a smaller and limited number of musicians. So in the 1950s, a blend of jazz, blues, gospel, country, and folk music broke onto the scene and changed the shape of music forever. Rock and roll busted onto the scene and changed society and the way people think forever. Although it is hard to give credit for who actually invented rock and roll, most historians give credit to the man in the picture, Bill Haley and his Comets, for their successful hit Rock Around the Clock. It was recorded in 1954, but did not enjoy any success until the year 1955. The rock and roll music actually frightened a lot of the older generation of Americans because of the craze that it caused in some of the teenagers. They thought that the devil had taken over society because of the long hair and the big clothes and the way they shook their hips. In 1959 was when they attributed the original death of rock and roll. Elvis Presley joined the army, and in Iowa, Clear Lake, Iowa actually, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper passed away on a stormy, snowy night in a very bad airplane accident. From the fiery death of rock and roll came a whole new monster. You drop the roll from the word and add any kind of word in front of to the rock, and out forth several different genres of the music. The British Invasion, also known as when the Beatles first came to America. It took the world by storm. No one knew what to think. From that era, everything switched over to a more psychedelic, drug-induced scene, as seen in the pictures of the Doors, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin. Unfortunately, the singers in all three of those groups passed away at the age of 27 and left a stinging impact on the music of rock. From there, in the 70s, punk rock took over, with several groups such as the Sex Pistols, Misfits, Ramones, The Clash, and then in the 80s, Black Flag, and Blondie carried on the tradition of punk rock. In the 1980s, a whole new monster was born, and rock music took over the scene like it never had before. These musicians made more money and became more popular than they ever had before. They had quite an impact on society. From the 80s classical rock came the glam period. Originally started in the 70s with the band Kiss, and even attributed a little bit with the Ziggy Stardust days of David Bowie. Glam rock became a whole new monster in the 1980s, became one of the most popular things in the world, where guys dressed like girls and girls' hair was almost a foot higher than their head. According to Richard Crawford's book, America's Musical Life, A History, the crazed and drugged lifestyles of the 1980s rock stars became a nuisance to society. Christian groups and government agencies went after these musicians and gave this music a bad name. Rock music was once again forced underground. At that time, record label executives realized that the hip-hop music was easy to record. It was cheaper to pay one singer and hire an unknown band to back them up. The tarnished name of rock and roll had become a liability, and the executives wanted to sweep it under the rug. From this form, heavy metal came. Heavy metal was a music that has been around since 1969 with Black Sabbath and carried on through the 80s with its traditional Ozzy Osbourne and the thrash scene. Most rock forms are now thought as heavy metal. There's 27 subgenres of the actual heavy metal itself. And in the list here, just to name a few, there's nu metal, which is the Korn and Disturbed and Linkin Park more modern metal. The death metal, scary Cannibal Corpse kind of singers. The thrash metal, your Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer. Pop rock, Nickelback, Pop Evil, Five Finger Death Punch, all the stuff that you hear on the radio. Groovecore has the Pantera, Slipknot, the more underground but popular groups. The goth has the scary Dimmu Borgir and Typo Negative. And the industrial scene is dominated by Nine Inch Nails, Fear Factory, and Prodigy. Now that we all have a greater knowledge of how rock music has evolved and become what it is today, let's take a look back at what we've learned. Rock music took the world by storm several different times over the 60-year history it has had. It's helped change society in many ways. It has brought people together and has pushed people apart. It has brought on many young untimely deaths due to drug use and other horrible things. The next time you hear a great rock song, especially if it's a new one, just take time to think about how far the music industry has come and how hard these rock musicians has had to push to get this music to keep it alive and get to your ears. Thank you very much.
I like the, and it's all what the noise is the conclusion. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Where you.
I'm
they
good on
always say
time,
to
aren't I?
do a
Why won't this
summary
stop?
or a conclusion, and I like that.
Why won't this stop?
I don't know.
I didn't realize there were so many
You turned the lock on.
heavy metal stuff.
I didn't do anything. I just pushed the red button.
This isn't good. I'm gonna have to fucking read.
Then calm